I mean, in the most recent times, like you're saying, it's harder to understand. Um, I'm still trying to figure out, what's the main connecting group. When you find um, because when you see how these people are connected, it makes me. I ask myself, like, how do they get introduced to each other? What's the mechanism that allows them to learn about each other, for who's introducing them to each other, right? Like I give an example of a person, like, because publicly we don't see it. The only group that I'm suspecting, I believe, is probably behind a lot of what's happening today would be the Knights of Malta, is I believe,
Okay.
possible answer. And I do believe that the Masons are to a large degree marginal. I could be wrong, but that's the perception I get, because I believe it's evolved beyond them. And so when you see a lot of the leading actors, it's like you look at somebody like Aleister Crowley, right? So Aleister Crowley, um, you know, he wasn't uh, he wasn't a powerful politician. He was more of a crackpot fringe personality, but he had an enormous
Yeah.
influence, right? But he did contribute to a lot of important political activities, right? So he was in New York, where he founded the Fatherland newspaper, where he's working with George Sylvester Varick, who was a very influential person in the American far right. Uh, he was connected with people like, I guess indirectly, Sidney Riley, but it's entire spy network. So basically, he was, a deep state spy. So what is his role, right? And you even go back to somebody like John Dee. He's not a monarch, or he wasn't a politician. He was just a sorcerer. So there's always seems to have been. In fact, you look at all the leading occultists
Was
going back to John Dee.
was,
Almost
was
all of
John
them.
Dee Queen Elizabeth's
Correct.
court
Yeah,
magician?
for a
Okay.
magician and a spy, right? So when you look back through all of the leading occultists in history, almost all of them have been um, serving the spy services, including like Pappas, Hannibal Blavatsky, Horace Crowley, and so on and so forth, right? So it's a strange, because you've got these personalities who are not afraid of presenting themselves publicly as occultists and openly proclaim their occult doctrines, because they don't have to worry about, their the credibility effectively. What's their relationship? Who's guiding who? Are these who's in charge?
Hmm.
That's the part I find hard to. What's their role? Are they like all just Rasputins that are sort of
Hmm.
whispering to the leaders and providing them guidance, and they don't mind to remain on the sidelines, or are they just sort of like handy stooges that are used when they're necessary? And this is the aspect of this occultism which is difficult to understand, because in fact it's always been like that. You always have these person. What you have is you have occultists throughout history who openly preserve the occult doctrines, publish about them, write about them, usually supported by some kind of establishment power. So it would have been mostly, it was the aristocracy throughout Europe, European through most of European history, and then recently you get other, more sort of outward political forces or organizations, like, I don't know, top of my head, let's say the Rothschilds, or the Council on Foreign Relation, or the Round Table, groups like that. So when you look, so if I'm going to bring up the example of Alexander Dugin, because if you look at Dugin, then he today would be, when we follow this history of the cult, he would be the logical successor of all these personalities that came before him. And then
But
if you
what
look at the,
influence does Dugan have?
well, that's the question,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, he seems to me like a marginal figure as well, at least in the West. And in Russia, maybe it's different. In the West, he seems to have some influence over like the right wing or alt right or whatever.
That's the way it appears. But when start to look at his connections, that's when you have to begin to wonder, right? So, like, just to name a few. So his main collaborator is Christian Boucher. Christian Boucher is supposedly head of the French OTO, and he's also connected to what's called the Group of Thebes. That connects him to Massimo Introving, who's one of the leading scholars of occultism today. Um, this that connects him basically to like cults like the Solar Temple. Dugan was also a friend of Claudio Muti, who was a friend of Julien, what's his name? Julien, the founder of the Solar Temple.
Hmm.
His main mentor was Jean Parvulescu,
Hmm.
who was a pupil of Raymond de Bellio, who was a leader of the Synarchist Empire movement in France, which connects him to that entire Synarchist movement. He was also friends with Antoine Pinet. Antoine Pinet was the founder of the Circle and the Bilderberg movement.
Hmm.
Pinet Circle is the umbrella organization of the Fascist International, which collects all the league and organizations. So when you look at Gladio, so Claudio Muti was a Gladio operative, Dugan's friend, Gladio operative, which was basically well, of which really came under the umbrella of the Fascist International. The Fascist International connects organizations like Permindex,
Mm.
right, which was involved in the JFK assassination, uh, which connects an organization today like the Council on National Policy, which is where you find Robert Mercer, Steve Bannon, so on and so forth. And then you find that who is the leading who's the leading guru behind the alt-right that the people like Bannon were exploiting to try to build support for the Russian campaign behind the election of Donald Trump, but Alexander Dugin. When you look at the rise of the right um, in Europe today, it's Russia, which is Dugin's strategy. Dugan is also connected to Kerry Bolton. Kerry Bolton is an official representative of the Order of Nine Angles, which is a neo-Nazi, satanic neo-Nazi organization, which is a major influence behind the accelerationist movement. Because
Right,
when you
right.
look at
Okay.
terrorism today, it's becoming far right, and it's part of the acceleration movement, links back to the process church. And the process church is where you find all the connections to Hollywood, and you can carry those all the way forward to today to the Me Too movement
Right.
because it involves people like um, Robert Evans, who was the director, who was the producer of Rosemary's Baby, who was also a friend of Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was also a friend of Syed Nasser, who was a friend of Alexander Dugin.
Right, right.
And this is
But
just some of the connections.
yeah, yeah. But the thing with a lot of these connections is though that it still doesn't necessarily mean that they align in their interests, right? Because like in some ways the interests of them align, but in other ways the interests of Russian state do not align with the interests of the U.S. government, right?
Mm, yeah,
And
at
so
least
that
not visibly.
yeah, yeah. Well. I mean, there'll be some ways in which they align, and others in which they don't align, and so
Yeah,
you'll have like a mix, a cocktail of interests, right? That
yeah,
sometimes align, sometimes don't align, and that's what makes it difficult to really grasp on where on the scale, where on the spectrum of like coordination
that's it. And
and
that's what the
agency it
research is
is.
for.
That's what the
Because the
research
way
is
I
for.
see it is that there's a lot of people, when they perceive contradictions, they believe that it's evidence against the conspiracy. Whereas I see it as it doesn't undermine the hypothesis. It just challenges the hypothesis and means that it requires research to explain why there's a contradiction.
Pointing out a lot of these ideologies, these schools of thought that have been influencing history, that contribute to a power structure that basically is exploitative, if I understand you correctly, right?
Yeah,
And is as suppressing human flourishing, suppressing human, you could say, existence, life. What would be something throughout history that isn't part of it, that is different, that is an alternative?
yeah.
Where's the truth to be found outside of putting all of that? I mean, obviously it's necessary to some extent, but I mean,
Mhm.
if you're not putting all of that intensive work into that you are putting into it, where
Yeah.
do you find something like that? Yeah, please.
Well, I'm gonna have to go religious
Yeah,
because that's
please.
what it is, and that's why I begin my six-volume book. My first chapter is called the introduction is called Cosmic Conspiracy. The only way to understand this, a lot of people try to understand what's going on. So are they after power? Are they after wealth? What is it? And the only way to understand it as a cosmic conspiracy. And then, another point is what I try to point out to people that my books are not the truth, right? If you look a lot of these a lot of these promises of things like, let's say, like Dan Brown's ridiculous
Novels or
his ridiculous novels suggest, that the truth is buried and preserved by these orders. You can't bury the truth because the truth is in our hearts. What what is constructed is a propaganda to create a perception of reality to induce you to betray yourself. So what all I'm deconstructing is I'm deconstructing that illusion, but people have ultimately betrayed. People know better, and the truth that they're betraying is the knowledge that they are responsible for uh, where they can to save others from affliction. And that's effectively, I mean, again, the whole myth of Western civilization, that's pretty much what it's designed to do. And you look at Western culture, it's designed to to um, encourage you to believe that, self-interest, or that you don't have much of a responsibility to your fellow neighbor. In fact, you could just give $100 of charity every month, and then you've done your duty, without
right. Yeah, yeah,
recognizing that each one of us has a central role to play in the
yeah.
foundational transformation of human society.
Right. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll find throughout, that's the competing, that's the battle, that's the cosmic truth. That is what all the prophets of the Bible and this, Jesus and the Quran have all tried to come and communicate to humanity.
Yeah.
What you get is that their followers, or people who claim to be their followers, hijack that message, create dogma, which remove the kernel of truth, and create basically, doctrinal mechanisms that are used to effectively quell portions of society. Or you have the rebels, the orchestrators, who are the conspirators, who are antithetical to this uh, ideal, and are working to build a society effectively to suppress it forever.
Right. So, if I understand you correctly, just like you could say the conspiracy or the power, the influence of power kind of pervades society in a lot of its aspects, the
Mm.
truth does so as well. Like it's also kind of, you could say, hidden in plain sight. It's also there
Yeah.
for people to
No, yeah.
embrace,
Mhm.
which is a great message, of course. Um,
Mhm.
Another point, is it right? Is it if did I catch it correctly from one of the podcasts I saw you on that you are a Muslim?
Yeah.
And so how did that come about? Have you always been one from family? Did you convert?
Yeah.
If you like to expand on that.
No, I was raised agnostic.
Okay.
And the story I always tell is, when I was about 7 years old, my parents had some guests over, and I passed by, and they were talking about Plato, Socrates and Plato and whoever else. And when after the guests left, I asked my mom, like, who were those guys? She said, well, those were guys, men who tried to figure out, what life is all about. And it really came as a shock to me. I, of course, only barely come into consciousness as a child, but to recognize that here you have these billions of people living on this planet, and they don't really know why.
Mm. That
It
is
was like,
a strange situation to
this is
say the
pretty
least. Yeah.
strange,
Yeah.
like, wow, like they've been trying to figure out that whole time, and people still don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We've had all this
So I
time
thought to
to
myself,
think about it, and like still haven't made
yeah.
any progress. Haven't figured it out.
So I set out to try to figure it out, and wasn't always a smooth journey. Uh, but I made a more concerted effort when I hit my early 20s. That's when I was in university, and and um and it was basically more of a spiritual transformation. And I was an atheist, I have to admit, for our time. But that's not because I didn't believe in God. It's because I didn't believe in the God I thought other people believed in.
Yeah,
And
but I
it's
mean, wouldn't you see? Like, I understand the position of like a lot of atheists to, or I can understand it to the
Mhm.
extent that, like, as you said, truth is also hidden in plain sight, can be found everywhere. There are aspects, even with the kind of power aspect, the oppressive aspect of, Western culture and all that. There are still aspects that you could consider redeeming to some extent, right? There is a sense of among people. There's a general sense of fairness, of rule of law,
Yeah.
of decency. There is a certain culture of that in the West as well, right? And I
Yes.
and I feel like, um, yeah, I feel like in atheism, a lot of it is still based on this kind of optimistic secular humanism,
Mhm.
but kind of not really wanting to go all the way to see where it comes from, and that it needs some
Yeah.
sort of deeper core,
That's
right?
it. Yeah.
Uh,
That's
but
the
but why
contradiction.
specifically Islam, and
Yeah.
how did you kind of decide that Islam is not in that sense part of the conspiracy or corrupted, right?
Yeah. So when I finally came to belief in God, by default, I sort of became, I can't say I became a Christian. I just assumed, oh, if, now that I believe in God, then I believe the Bible is a book from him. And I started reading it, and the message really struck me, particularly the book of Matthew, because really, keeping away from Paul, the more, which is much more complicated, but more that whole idea of like forgiveness and compassion and charity, that's really, what made sense. And but it's because I didn't really think of myself necessarily as a Christian. I didn't start going to church. I didn't pick a denomination. I didn't think that my search had ended. So I continued reading and I continued studying. And I made the intention of trying to study all the wisdom literature so that I could make myself, make an informed decision.
Yeah,
And so
makes
I kept
sense.
reading, and
I,
I,
I, I have the
I
same. I'm on the same project. I'm not done yet, but
that's it.
yeah,
So I read the Bhagavad Gita. Ironically, I read the Bhagavad Gita, and it regularly mentions the importance of prayer. So I thought, yeah, that would be a great way to sort of, develop myself spiritually to sort of, connect with myself and to try to align myself to focus and things like that. And I said, you know what, the Muslims have a beautiful prayer. Let me check them out. So when I did, I am ashamed to say that I was grossly ignorant about Islam. I had no idea that it was at all connected to the Judeo-Christian tradition. But when I saw that, the two important aspects, that's three, that spoke to me was the idea that Islam was a continuation of the Old Testament and the New Testament. It also corrected ideas like that Jesus was a messenger and that was a man, a human being, and a messenger, and it allowed me to more focus on because there's something very dogmatic about God is Son and so on and so forth. I much prefer the
the
focus
the
that
the Trinity, the dogma of the
point was
Roman
the
Catholic.
message, right?
Mm.
Yes, the point wasn't the doctrine you're supposed to believe. The point was this message of compassion and charity, which was at the core, and also that God was uh immaterial. Not you can't even say immaterial, is incomparable, exists without a place, without a form, which finally answered the my core understanding of what a creator power would be like. And so it just, without really thinking about it, I just kind of accepted it. So I mean, Islam has been subjected to these influences just as much as Judaism or Christianity. And this goes back to almost to the very earliest centuries of Islam. So this is what I began tracing in because it goes back to a group, a society in the Islamic world known as the Sabians, that was an occult society that taught Neoplatonism and Hermeticism. So the exact same occult. In fact, much of the basis of Freemasonry is this myth of who they refer to as these Eastern mystics that the Templars, quote unquote, rescued from the Holy Land.
Are they related to in any way to Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and these people?
No,
No.
no, not necessarily, no.
Okay.
But but yes, they are connected. Well, they are connected to um, Islamic philosophy because this is the group that introduced Greek philosophy to the Islamic world, and they were served mainly as translators. So they translated a lot of these ancient texts to Arabic, and that's how the Islamic world discovered them. But they mostly influenced Sufism and also a group called the Brethren of Sincerity.
Hmm.
So that's crucial. So you have now in the 13th century person, especially of a person like Ibn Taymiyyah, and why he becomes an important character because he's deliberately revived later by Saudi Arabia or the Saudis. So and it also comes back um, to the Frankists and um, the Asiatic Brethren, because the Asiatic Brethren is a reference to these Eastern mystics. It's the story that the entire myth of Scottish Rite Freemasonry is that it derives from the sort of Eastern teachings which were rescued and brought to survived in Scotland.
I assume Bin
And
Wahhab is also tied into this.
pardon?
Wahhabism is also tied into this.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So there's
yeah.
two important branches. One of them is Wahhabism, which was started in the 1700s by Abdul Wahhab, who appears to have been a British agent. By numerous accounts, by some Arab historians, he was a Donme Jew, as were the Saudis. When you
Okay.
look at the teachings, what's most incriminating about the Saudi teachings is that Abdul Wahhab claimed, because up until his time, the um, the orthodoxy was very well established in the Islamic world. It wasn't really anything that was questioned. But Sheikh Abdul Wahhab made reference to Ibn Taymiyyah to argue for a rejection of Islamic um, classical Islam in favor of his version. And then he said that anybody who disagreed with him is a non-believer, and non-believers have to be fought. That was the crux of his case. So that's why when he aligned himself with Ibn Saud in 1750s, 60s, I can't remember the years, first thing they did is they attacked the neighboring villages. They slaughtered all the unbelievers, which was then under control of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire finally basically quelled the movement, but they managed to survive in small numbers. And it was only after, with the help of the British, that with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, that the British installed the Saudis in Saudi. They named the territory after themselves.
Right.
But then the Saudis aligned themselves with Jamal Afghani, and Jamal Afghani is a crucially important, very strange character. He was the Grand Master of the Masons of Egypt, but he called himself, they used to refer to themselves as Brethren of Purity in
Hmm.
reference to the this group that had been influenced by the Sabians and supposedly introduced occult doctrines to the Templars.
Just quickly, you mentioned there's two movements. You had Wahhabism. What was the other one?
Salafism.
Salafism. Wahhabism and Salafism are not the same thing,
They're
or
not the
they're
same,
not
but
part of one another.
they're practically the same.
Practically the
So
same. Okay.
politically they became one and the same.
Okay.
Wahhabis, because it's come out that Afghani was a pretty dodgy guy, so they tried to distance themselves from it, but then still related. So basically, Afghani now at the same time he was one of the what's called ascended masters of H.P. Blavatsky, right? And he also posed as a guy named Haji Sharif and introduced Saint Yves d'Alved. Uh,
And where do
uh,
you find the true teachings? Where do you find the undistorted?
Unpolluted.
Yeah.
Well, that's the whole point, right? What happened is that in the early centuries of Islam, you get the first several centuries of
The
uh,
Umayyads.
the respected scholars who had formulated an entire construct of Islamic law, and it was sort of they reduced as much fluff as they could, and they reduced it down to four schools, which were then considered uh, all they differed from each other, but they were all accepted as potential variations on the single truth. So those four schools, and what happens is they close what's called the doors of ijtihad. So from that point forward, you know, the debate is done. Let's agree on the fundamentals and let's move forward.
And
And
you also have
that's
that notion that Muhammad was the last prophet, right? It was the final
yes,
word, right?
right.
So, would you, as a Muslim, you would obviously believe that, right? That he was the final
Yes.
prophet. Okay,
Mhm.
so that in that sense, I see the interesting kind of interpretation or lineage that Islam opens up when it kind of respects Christ as a major as a major prophet, right?
Prophet.
But he's
Mhm.
not like part of a holy trinity, not part
Right.
of any of that.
No.
I understand that. Um, However, it's like in practice. I think a lot of the criticism that Islam may get today is that this kind of focus on keeping the text pure and not having any, you know, being the last word of God and all that,
Mhm.
that kind of gives it an inbuilt tendency to revert back to an age that's no longer compatible with our age
Right.
today.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
Well, that's funny because that would have been Afghani's Jamal Afghani's argument, and he did that at the service of the British, because the British now were starting to encroach on the Middle East. The Islamic society was clearly deteriorating. Ottoman Empire was called it known as the sick man in Europe, and so the British needed to modify Islam in order to do what they wanted to do. And that's why they worked with somebody like Afghani, and particularly his pupil, which is Muhammad Abdu. Uh,
And Islam until then, what
yeah,
how can you, it's obviously hard to summarize that,
yeah.
but what was Islam like, or what was the dominant face of Islam under the Ottomans until then?
In which way? Because it was a complex society, right? Like
Yeah,
it's
yeah, but I mean, like, how did it differ from the interpretations that came afterwards with
well,
Wahhabism and all that?
I mean, you have things like a lot of sort of economic practices that the British wanted to introduce in places like Europe, like introduce banking, insurance, things like that. Um, Yeah, I don't know all the details, but it's basically Mohammed Abdu worked closely with Lord Cromer, and they worked together to try to through the University of Al Azhar in Egypt to try to find ways to modify. Uh, it's basically it opened things up. I mean, you look at Islamic terrorism in itself is a perfect example, right? So it's impossible in classical Islam to claim that killing of civilians uh, for purely political purposes, no strategic gain or advantage, no military advantage is somehow jihad. That is a direct consequence of Wahhabi influence because how they sidestep things is I say, oh, we're going to go back to the sources. So you go and interpret the sources like anybody can read the Bible and come up with an interpretation, and say that the Bible says so. But no, when you do so, you have to validate it against the recognized experts and confirm that you've talked to uh, experts who are the current inheritors of 900 years of tradition who have validated that yes, that is not saying it's the truth, it is the accepted opinion of this is how it should be interpreted. When you have that kind of democratic input, it's much harder to introduce the kind of deviance that the terrorists have. And that's the core of it. That's how effectively they continue to do so today, and that's principally the reason why they've attacked it.
Right, right. Okay, okay. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. This was so interesting. So much fun talking to you. You've got an encyclopedic memory. Gotta say, it's almost like when you go down those rabbit holes on Wikipedia and you click on something and then there's like five hyperlinks. You click on the every time I bring up something,
Yeah,
you got five hyperlinks.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so it's like obviously for a podcast, it's already way longer than I usually do them. For podcasts, I kind of have to like try and see that we we don't get too lost in different parts. But
that's
yeah,
it.
this was really cool. This was really fascinating to talk to you. And yeah, please let us know as well where we can find your work.
Sure. Thank you. So my website, most recent one is ordoabcal.ca. That's where you find links to all my books. I've got six published now. Two of them, the two most recent ones are online. So you can read them online. That's Ordo Abcal. There's 6 volumes of it. And my most recent book on Zionism, there's a link to that too. Either you can read online or you can order the paper version from Amazon or Kindle.
Right, right. Very cool. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Sean. It was a pleasure.